Hey, it's Mark Ferguson with Investor More. We're at the complex, a property I spent a ton of money remodeling, and we've had a tenant here for a while who's not doing amazing, and now we have to do mediation with that tenant thanks to one of Colorado's new rental property landlord laws. So, this will be interesting. I'm going to show you what the process is, how it works, why we have to do it, and then we'll see how it goes. So this is a property I bought a couple of years ago now. Maybe it's been almost 3 years. It's crazy how time flies. And this is what it looked like when I first bought it. It does not look like this now. It was 7 units. So it had this house we're standing in right now, had a small studio unit as well, and then 5 other units. So one of the tenants here, I'm not going to name names or say who it is, missed a rent payment. So this happened a couple of months ago. And they had claimed that their account got hacked, their bank account, and that's why they couldn't pay rent. And so we've actually heard this story before. I actually heard it, if you guys remember, the real estate broker who rented a property from me as kind of a studio, residential / commercial spot. He paid the first month's rent and deposit, and that was it, never paid again. Claimed his bank account got hacked. He was just full of it, basically. But this person also said their bank account got hacked. And so they didn't pay that month. We were talking with them, trying to work with them, set up a payment plan. They said they couldn't pay anything else. And then the next month came along and they paid, but they're still a month behind. And so I think they feel that they just don't have to pay that month and that's how it works, which we're not really okay with. So we posted an eviction notice. And we hadn't heard anything from them. It actually was on their door for a couple of days, which had me worried for a while. I'm like, oh man, I hope something didn't happen. But then it was gone. And they didn't talk to us, didn't call us. They just left a note in our Dropbox one day saying, we request mediation. And I was like, I forgot about this law and how this worked. Colorado passed a new law, just went into effect last year, where if certain parties are renting from you and it's an eviction, they can request mediation. You have to go through mediation before the eviction can proceed. So we're hoping by posting the notice, they would get caught up, they would talk to us, we get a payment plan going, get something happening, because they've just kind of not been helpful at all. But instead, we've got this mediation thing going. And so Colorado has a lot of interesting laws coming on the boards. They've had a lot of really interesting laws that got shot down but almost passed too. So it'll be interesting to see how this works. But Colorado also recently passed a no-clause eviction law, but luckily it's much more watered down than California. Some other states will require landlords to pay relocation costs and a couple months' rent to tenants if they end their lease and they don't have a valid reason to end the lease, which might be, late on rent or damage to property, etc. Just because a landlord wants a new tenant or to sell or do different things, they might not be able to get rid of the tenant unless they pay them. Now with Colorado's law, it's much less strict on the landlord. If the landlord wants to sell, make major renovations, move into the property, or have family members move into the property, they can still do an eviction and the tenant's lease. Now, they can also raise the rent if it's a reasonable amount on the tenant as well. They don't have to pay relocation assistance if they do this either. That was taken out of the bill, which was tried to pass last year and did not pass, thankfully. So the new bill for relocation, or not relocation, but for no-cause evictions is much more watered down in Colorado. Not as crazy as some of the other states. And it doesn't really do a whole lot unless the landlord, it's just, I don't even know how it will come into play, honestly. It's supposed to stop retaliation from landlords who don't want to rent to tenants because they complain about repairs or things like that. But there's so many different outs and different clauses and different things. I'm not sure if it will have much impact on landlords or tenants, because one of those clauses too, if the tenant violates the lease or is a nuisance at all to other tenants, then you can still evict them. Or end their lease, you have to give them 90 days notice to do that, which is already on the books in Colorado as well. There was another crazy law where they wanted to give first right of refusal to states and cities to buy rental properties like this. If anything was over 5 units, you'd have to notify the city, nonprofits, that they have the opportunity to buy it and give them the right to buy it before any investors can. Luckily, that got shot down, but there's a lot of interesting things out there. There's limits on deposits. You can only charge twice the rent for a deposit. There's limits on pet rent fees. There's limits on late fees. And also, if someone gets behind on rent and you post an eviction notice, they don't have to pay late fees to catch up. They just have to pay the rent. So there's all kinds of restrictions, rules, regulations, things you have to pay attention to in Colorado to make sure you're on the up and up, doing things correctly. And it can be confusing. It can be very confusing. So this is what this property looked like before. Now let's talk about the mediation process and how all of that works. Here is the eviction mediation new legislation from 6/7/23. Schedule your mediation date here. And we'll read this real quick in case you can't see it. Mandatory mediation before filing for eviction, HB 23-1120. The bill requires a landlord and residential tenant to participate in mandatory mediation prior to commencing an eviction action in court. If the residential tenant receives supplemental security income, federal Social Security disability insurance, or cash assistance through the Colorado Works program, collectively cash assistance. So if anybody receives assistance pretty much in any way, they are part of this program. The exceptions to mandatory mediation: the landlord and residential tenant do not have to participate in the mediation if the residential tenant did not disclose or declined to disclose in writing to the landlord that the residential tenant receives cash assistance. The landlord is a 501c (3) nonprofit organization that offers their tenants opportunities for mediation. Or the landlord has 5 or fewer single-family rental homes and no more than 5 total rental units. So that does not include me because I have more than 5 units. This one property has more than 5 units. And this tenant did disclose their main source of income was Social Security, I believe, on their application. It continues, the role of the Office of Dispute Resolution. Required mediations will be compensated and scheduled through the Office of Dispute Resolution. Schedule mediation session within 14 days after landlord's request. Connect parties to mediation services provided by independent neutral contract mediators who are trained and screened to handle these cases professionally. Support language access and ADA accommodations. Pay the mediators for tenants' portion of the mediation fees through funding by the state of Colorado. Answer general questions about this mandatory mediations process. Scheduling process, I've got to contact the office to schedule it. That's fairly easy. They give me a form online that has different times. I've got to coordinate the date with the tenant before scheduling on the website. And it is the landlord's responsibility to provide ODR with the correct email and phone number for the tenant. The landlord must inform the tenant immediately of the scheduled date. Both parties will receive a confirmation via email, and the mediator will send payment instructions to the landlord and will send Zoom video meeting links to both parties via email. The costs will be $50 per hour with a non-refundable advance deposit of 2 hours minimum, $100. There will be no cost for the tenant. The state of Colorado will pay that. Can the parties use a private mediator outside of ODR? Cases are being scheduled through ODR with ODR contract mediators to ensure mediation is provided at no cost to the tenants, to collect the required reporting data, and to ensure mediators are trained and neutral. If the landlord decides to use a private mediator, the court must determine whether the landlord has complied with the requirements, yada, yada, yada. So we've got to do that, and then if I click on the scheduled date, only landlords, please coordinate with tenant beforehand, tells me what my fee is. We click on there. It gives me all these different people I can use, or I can just say no preference. And it gives me some dates for when I can do the mediation. And I am doing this next Tuesday at 10 a.m. The Tenant couldn't do it on Monday because they had a doctor's appointment. So we'll see how this goes. And of course, I'll have an update for everybody on here how it goes as well. And this is what the complex looked like after we remodeled it, painted it, put on a new roof, did a ton of work to this property. So I also want to talk about what this legislation, different things do to rental property prices and tenants who might want to rent properties. Now, of course, always talk to attorneys for specific laws and specific situations, whether you're handling them in Colorado or other states, to make sure you're compliant and all of that. Make sure you talk to attorneys for what you can put in leases and can't put in leases, all of that. But the more legislation that is added, usually the harder it makes it on tenants. And I know a lot of this legislation is meant to help tenants and give them more opportunities and make things more fair. But if it makes it more expensive, if it makes it a difficult process for landlords, they're going to pass those costs on to the tenants. That's just how it works, because there's not tons of margin and huge amounts of money many landlords are making. I know the media and different places out there make it seem like everyone who owns rental properties is rich, but that's not the case. And yes, I've done very well, but that's not because of the margins between, the rent and expenses I have on properties. A lot of it is fixing up these properties, adding tons of value, refinancing them, possibly selling them at some point. It's the house flips we do. It's other stuff we do. The rental properties are great. They've been amazing. But as far as strictly collecting rent versus the expenses, it's very hard for that portion of cash flow to make someone rich, because there's tight margins, especially with high prices right now, especially with high interest rates right now. It doesn't make sense for most people to even buy a rental property right now with rates so high. You kind of have to buy something that's an amazing deal, hope rates go down eventually, and that's when you'll make your money. So when these laws are enacted, and what it does to many landlords, I'm not saying we would ever do this, but if you know that you have to go to mediation and jump through these hoops and pay this extra money and take this extra time, and who knows what the mediator is going to say or what they're going to require, if they have a bias towards landlords or not, you never know. We've seen lots of judges have bias towards landlords. They let squatters live in one of my properties for an extra month just because they had nowhere to go, who weren't on the lease and never paid rent. So you never know what's going to happen in these situations. Well, that's going to make a lot of landlords say, I'm not going to rent to anybody who meets these requirements where I have to do mediation. Now, Colorado also has a law that says you can't discriminate based on income source, which is supposed to counteract, landlords from doing that. But just because they have a law saying that doesn't mean all landlords will abide by it, or there aren't other valid reasons they could come up with for not renting to people, right? It doesn't have to be, that specific reason. But if there's other reasons, if there's other question marks, and then all of a sudden they have this on top of it, well, that could be the pushing, the tipping point of saying, no, we're not going to rent to this tenant. So now tenants who have assistance, have these other, income sources, are going to have a lot harder time finding properties to rent. And I know that's not the goal of this legislation. I know that wasn't, the government saying, oh, let's make it harder for tenants. No, they didn't mean to do that. But they don't always think about the outcome of this legislation and how it will impact people in the long run. The same thing happens with rent control. People think, oh, rent control lowers the price of rent. It actually doesn't. There's been multiple studies, including the San Francisco study, that shows rents are 15% higher than they would be without rent control. Because when you have rent control, it limits how much landlords can raise rent on current tenants. Well, it can't stop them from raising rents on vacant properties or properties they buy. And so what you see is the landlords will raise rent as high as they possibly can whenever they have a chance, because they know they might not be able to raise it when they get a long-term tenant, or raise it enough to make up for their costs and expenses that keep going up. So what you see is rents are actually higher with rent control. And then you see, some states like New York saying, oh, well, then we've got to make legislation that doesn't let them raise rents higher. And it just gets worse and worse and worse, and piled upon until you have this massive legislation meant to, help tenants. That actually makes things way more expensive, way more complicated, makes landlords not even want to buy rentals or have rental properties. And if you do that, then you're shrinking the rental property stock or inventory. And if there's less inventory, that means prices go higher too. So there's all kinds of things to consider with legislation, with requirements. And I know a lot of people say, well, that's just greedy of landlords to raise costs or raise the rent if their costs go up. Well, that's reality. Like I said, if it isn't worth it for them to buy rentals, they won't. They won't build them. They won't buy them. And then there's going to be a shortage of rentals, which there already is, and that will push rents higher too. So really, I mean, I'm not saying that all restrictions and I'm not saying that fair housing laws are bad or anything like that, but I'm just saying the more restrictions you have, the more legislation you have, usually the higher prices will get, the less incentive builders and investors will have to buy and remodel, and then the less inventory you'll have, and ultimately it hurts the people who are trying to rent the properties. So on this deal, this one, we spent a massive amount of money, a massive amount of time on it, and for it to be worthwhile, we have to have a good chunk of profit in this deal. So I paid $550,000 for it. It's worth over $1 million. It makes a little bit of money on cash flow, but not a ton. There's no way the rent coming in would justify the amount of money we spent on it, but the value increase does justify it. But if things keep getting harder and more difficult and we can't collect rent and we have to go to mediation and we have to allow 17 service dogs, which I won't get into that right now, but it makes it much less worthwhile, and it makes it people more unlikely to do projects like this and make housing and create places for people to live. So that's what's going on in my world right now. It's not the end of the world. It hopefully won't delay things too long. Who knows? Maybe it'll help the tenant come up with a payment plan, since they won't, we've tried to get them to do that and help us out. Maybe the mediator will jumpstart that process. I don't know. But that's the situation. That's this property. That's my thoughts on other legislation. And of course, we'll have an update on this, our other properties, our flips, our rental properties, laundromats, all that stuff coming up. And it'll be very interesting to see how this mediation goes. And if anybody else has done it, let me know. You can always comment and let me know what other crazy laws you've got in your states too. And I'm not saying this is crazy, but I know there's a lot of other crazy laws out there. And we'll go from there.